strategize together. Let's hear it from an expert. Join the conversation, it's informative and free. You and me, let's talk some strategy. Now here's your host, Dorien, Morin-van vanDam.
Hello, everybody. It is me, Dorien, Morin-van vanDam, with another episode of Strategy Talks. If you have a podcast and you have guests, you need to be here. We're talking to an expert on podcast interviewing. But if you are thinking about starting a podcast and you want to be a guest on other people's podcasts, you also need to be here, because we're going to give tips for both sides of the aisle: how to interview and how to be interviewed, how to show up as the best guest ever. So before I introduce you to today's guest on my show, who is an expert in podcasting, I want to do a quick shout out and hello to everybody who's here live, and all of those of you who might watch this on the replay. Put hashtag replay in the comments. And if you're listening to Strategy Talks as a podcast, welcome so much. We want to make sure that you know that we appreciate your listening. Before I introduce our guest today, a quick shout out to our sponsor, Social Insider. They are the intuitive dashboard for social media analytics, reporting, and competitors analysis for brands and agencies. If you need data, you need Social Insider. So without much further ado, here's today's guest, Victoria Bennion. How are you, Victoria?
Hi, I'm great. Thank you. Really glad to be here today.
Yeah. So if you're watching live, if you're with us today, put in the comments where you're joining us from. We'd love to know where you're watching, whether you're on LinkedIn or YouTube, or maybe on Facebook. But we're going to talk about podcasting on both sides of the aisle, right? Interview tips on if you're the host and you want to get the most out of your guests, but also maybe you've been asked to be a guest and it's something new to you, or you want to show up as the best guest ever. We're going to talk to you about with Victoria about all of that. So who is Victoria? She is the founder of the Victoria Bennion podcast booking agency, where she works with expert business owners to build their brands and grow the businesses through leveraging podcast interviews. She also hosts the Best Guest podcast and is co-author of the most amazing marketing book ever by Mark Schaefer and friends. So that's amazing. I actually didn't realize you were part of the book, Victoria. That's great.
Yeah, it was a really great experience.
That's wonderful. So, the best guest ever. What's that all about? Let's start with that.
Okay, so if you're being a guest on other people's podcasts, there are some ways that you can really make a great impression, be a good guest. And the first thing, that really starts before your interview. So when the host says yes, they may give you a link to book on to the show, or they may agree a date. Don't keep them waiting. Get that done within 48 hours. Otherwise, you kind of risk looking uninterested, or hosts, can only have a certain number of slots sometimes, and they fill up really quickly, and you can lose the slot, and then you have to go back and say, I didn't do it in time, So that first impression starts way before the interview. Again, once you get it all booked, hosts might ask you for your biography, your headshot, any other information. Get that over to them ASAP again, and then you're nice and organized and you're making a good impression way before the interview.
Those are some great suggestions. And as a podcast host, and I'm sure you're dealing with that too, we have seen those who are busy who say, yes, I'd love to be on your podcast, and then don't fill out the paperwork. And I don't know how far in advance you book, but I sometimes book out 12 weeks, 14 weeks. And so if somebody says yes but doesn't book, then they're 4 months out or 5 months out. So then I feel bad. So I love this advice. This is great. If you're invited to a podcast and you get sent a link, book it. That's great advice. So what else?
Absolutely.
What else can we do?
Okay, so have some headphones and have an external microphone. If the podcast is using video, find that out as well. You can, if the host doesn't tell you and you don't know, you can ask that question just to make sure that you are prepared. So it's not going to be good enough quality if just to use the computer's inbuilt microphone, and you're going to need earphones. And I know I've had people say to me, but I sound fine, don't I sound fine? But once that's blown up on that audio, you'd be surprised. It's just not going to give hosts that quality, and you want them to be able to use the interview too. So they're giving you a slot, they're putting time and effort into it. You want it to sound as good as possible, you want it to look as good as possible, because also that way you're helping listeners stay tuned in. They're not going to turn off because it's crackly and they can't hear you and it's all breaking. So get some basic equipment.
So that's a really good point, right? So we're talking about podcasting, which main focus is audio. So if you're thinking about being guests on other people's podcasts and you're using that as a way to get in front of somebody else's audience, because that's really what we're talking about, you need to invest in good sound, and you need to be willing to have a quiet spot to record, and you need to be willing to have a good microphone, use the headset, and get that good audio out. Those are great points that you're making, Victoria, because we don't want to waste anybody's time and not have a good audio, because we're talking about podcasting. Yes, we have video to go with it, and that's an opinion, right? Do we want to do video while we're recording the podcast? Do we multitask? Do we want to be able to put it everywhere? And I do that. Obviously, this live show becomes a podcast. And if you like video and you're thinking about doing a podcast, this is a great way to get in front of your audience, right? To do a live show and then take the audio, strip the audio off and make it a podcast. But you need to make sure you have good audio in order to do that. So then what about preparation on the topic? So you say you're a guest, you're going to be on a podcast. What do you need to do to prepare?
So hosts run their show slightly differently. Some are going to give you advanced questions, or they might just give you an idea of the topic that they want to cover. So if you have that information, make sure that you do know what you're talking about a little bit. You could do some bullet points. So say 3 or 4 points, or you've got an idea of where the interview might go. Make sure that you've got some examples to illustrate the points. Make sure that you're going to the interview with the intention of adding value to the audience. Your agenda definitely doesn't want to be to sell. So I know we talked about that you want to be on the podcast to get in front of the host audience, to reach wider people, but you do need to go with the right intention of sharing, adding value, and through guests, through the audience listening to you, they're going to want to connect with you just through what value you share and who you are. So don't go in and be salesy. I mean, I've heard of hosts who've had guests and they've just pushed sales and they've not used the interview, so it's in no one's interest. So take some time to prepare, to know your points. You probably do. You're probably talking about topics that you're an expert in. If you're a small business owner, a marketer, or whatever, you know what you're talking about, but it can just help to go through it a little bit and just think of stories that you might share, because stories make you a more memorable guest and it helps establish that connection, and it helps you to be more entertaining and it builds that trust. So it's really worth thinking through some stories that you can share.
That's a great point. I have a follow-up question for that, because I think that's a dilemma that sometimes we get into as podcast hosts. So I might ask somebody to be my guest because I met them at the conference, or I think they're interesting, or I've been on their podcast and I go, oh, come on my podcast. Who then gets to decide on what the topic is? So let's talk about that, if you will, because you kind of touched on that, on how to prepare. But is it the responsibility of the guest to say, I want to talk about this, or is it the responsibility of the host to say, this is what I want to talk about because this is what my audience wants? And the reason I'm asking this, for example, I've worked with somebody before who has several books, and a new book came out, and she really wanted to talk about the topic in that last book. But the hosts were only familiar with the previous book. So every time she would go to a podcast, they would reference the other books and not the new one. And she's like, I kind of don't want to talk about that topic anymore. I have this new topic. Is that something that, as a guest, can you say, this is what I want to do? Or do you, where does that piece of communication lie? And where does that responsibility lie?
So when we're pitching our clients as guests on shows, we come up with some suggested topics and questions that they can talk about. So when we pitch, we would go out and say, these are some of the topics that they can talk about, and then work with the host on that. I mean, I usually find it when it comes about that way, they'll say, oh, this could be quite good for our audience. Although sometimes you do have a host who says, oh, could they talk about this actually? This is sort of a gap that we've got. And I think, and so then it's a bit of back and forth, really. It's trickier if it's somebody you know who's invited you on, I suppose. It's often the host. In that case, I'd be kind of talking to your client who's got the books about how maybe she can weave that new topic in, or try to direct in that way a little bit. But yes, I think it's perfectly okay to say to the host, look, I've got this new book and I could talk about this from it. But also, weave it in gently in the conversation.
That makes sense. So it's a little bit. So it's that pre-conversation where that happens. And if you show up to a podcast and the host has your old book and it's holding it up and say, we're going to talk about this, you're going to have to go in the moment and go with that, I guess.
I guess so. I think it's, you really want to have had some conversation beforehand, or maybe you could request a pre-interview to just talk over the topics, or just offer to send the host a copy of your new book if they don't already have it. You know, I've got this new book out, and if you've got, a number of copies at your disposal, you could always say, and, if you'd like a couple of copies to give away to listeners, that's something that we sometimes do with clients, and then hopefully that might get the host in the thinking space around the new book.
I love that. Those are great suggestions. And if you're listening to this or watching this, if you have a new book or you're launching a new program or a new product, being on podcasts is a great way to get the word out, right? And being on other people's podcasts sometimes even works better than on your own podcast. Of course, on your own podcast, you can talk about any topic you want and you can promote anything you want, but tapping into somebody else's audience and being in front of new people, talking about a new product, service, a book, or speaking, something where you're speaking about, or a course that you're teaching, is going to be super, super powerful. So now let's jump to the other side, right? Because we talked about, if you're a guest, what if you're the host and you have done all your preparation? What do you do when a guest doesn't show up?
Oh my goodness. Oh, that's difficult. So are we talking about a live show when your guest doesn't come up?
Either one. I mean, I've had both happen. Happen.
Yes. Do you know, I had that recently. A host contacted me and a guest hadn't showed up, and she said, I'm really stuck. It was someone I knew, and she said, can you come on and do, fill in a spot for me? So I guess I was actually booked in about a month later, so she was just trying to move me up the list. So I guess you can do that. I think that's where, if your podcast interview isn't just interviews, maybe you have some solo episodes, that's the time you can pop in a solo episode. Or as you were saying, make sure that you've got a few kind of lined up, have a few in the bank all the time, so that if you lose a guest, you've still got something that you can publish that week.
Yeah, I've had to do that before, where a live person didn't show up and I had one prepared, pre-recorded, that I stuck in the slot. So I guess that's a good way. How about if you're pre-recording? How many chances would you give a guest that doesn't show up?
I do usually give 2, but that's for me. That's probably about what I do. I don't know. It depends on the reason. I guess it depends on the reason that they give you. If they just don't show up, that's not so good. But if something's come up, some kind of emergency, and they need to reschedule, probably give them one or two sort of chances. But after that, I'd be thinking, I don't think they're really interested in this. Let's find someone else who's
right. Yeah, no, and that's, when everything else takes priority over your interview, that's when you know. So what can somebody do to be a good guest? I know we're jumping kind of back and forth between hosting guests and being a guest, but if there is a list of things that they can do besides being on time and being prepared, is there anything else that they should do? Should they offer to promote? What are some things that? What are some things
what I
that
was
a
going to
good
say.
guest? Yes. Okay. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, definitely. You want to come to the interview with what else can you do for the host? They're giving you access to this audience that they've taken the time to build. So you don't want to come on and just be taking, you want to be giving too. But promoting the episode is actually in everyone's best interest. It's in your best interest, because if you promote the episode that you're going to be on, more people are going to hear about the show, more people are going to listen to the episode. It's going to drive more traffic to the host website if that's where the podcast is hosted, and then more people are going to hear about your episode. So it's so important to promote the episode when you're on it. And that can also start before. You can do a quick social media post, like I'm really looking forward to speaking to Dorien on Strategy Talks, and just let people know. So if that's a live show, you're helping bring along the audience at the time. And afterwards, make sure that you are sharing it. You're sharing it when it goes live, and you can keep sharing it. This doesn't have to be, a one-off thing. That's a great benefit of podcast interviews, is this content that they give you as well, that you can keep resharing. You can pull out different bits, you can take clips, you can take quotes, you can make audiograms. It doesn't have to just be, I was on this podcast. You can do it in so many different ways. And then you're just continuing to boost the show, but also it's great for your authority. It's great for providing content to your audience.
So that's a great point that you bring up. So the repurposing of the podcast, whose responsibility is that? Is that something that the host should do and give the clips to the guest? Or if the host doesn't provide that, can the guest say, can I have the file, and the guest takes care of it? Which one, or can it go both ways?
So I think it's ideal if the host does this, because again, as a host, so coming from a host point of view at the moment, you really want the guest to share the show and like amplify the episode to their audience. So if you provide them with assets, if you make it easy for them, then it's more likely to happen. But again, and we work with hosts, some do, some don't. And we always ask, if we're booking guests, we always ask the host if we can have permission to repurpose it for our clients, and then they will do it themselves or get their teams to do it if not. But I think from a host point of view, I would at least try to provide some basic graphics just to make it easy.
Okay, so you're talking about graphics, but you could also provide, besides graphic, you could provide what else?
You could give them the transcript, you can give them the file, you could create a blog post, you could give them example social media posts that they can copy and paste. Definitely make sure that they've got your handles for social media and ask them to tag you so that you're aware, and then you can comment. As you said, you can make the video clips, the audiograms. It's how much time you've got, but I mean, it depends what software you've got, but often it's quite easy to get a transcript and do a few graphics.
Okay, so what software would you recommend for doing some of these things?
So we often use Descript, so that gives you the transcripts, but Rev, you can get transcripts, or there's so many, aren't there? So many things available, so it doesn't need to be costly depending on what you use, but you can just pop that in a file. We tend to put together a file with the assets and just share it with the guest.
Okay, so when we've talked about all kinds of things we should and shouldn't do as a perfect guest and a perfect host, actually we've talked about what we should do. Let's talk about what we shouldn't do. Are there some things that are just is going to make the job of a host harder, or as a guest that you should really avoid doing?
So do your best when you make that appointment for your podcast interview to keep it, as we said. I think if you chop and change, that's not great. We did say be on time, so I'd probably add to that, be early. So on time really means early. So especially if it's a live, if it's 1 o'clock, don't show up at 1 o'clock. You need to be ready. Even if you're waiting and then the host comes on afterwards, that's good. It's just, you don't want to be rushing, and you also really need to check your equipment is working before, because sometimes when you connect, things can all go wrong even if you checked it before. So having a bit of a buffer, so that's good. Another thing that I think is this, probably from the listener point of view particularly, but it's very good to think through your call to action at the end of the podcast. So the host typically asks you where listeners can go to connect, and it's just good to bear in mind that when people are listening to podcasts, sometimes they're driving or they can be out jogging and they might not have a pen to paper to hand. So you don't want to give too many options. That's something we always say to our clients, make it easy for people to remember or to find you. So, ideally one place.
That's a really good tip. So make sure that you put everything in one tip. And I'm going to ask you that at the end. You're going to give us a place to go. But I had a couple more questions. But if you're listening, if you're watching, Victoria is kind of doing that show and tell. She's going to give us one place to go to meet her, where she has information for you if you want to know more about her and her business. So we're going to provide that at the end, that link, and it's going to be very, very simple and easy to do. So as a podcast guest, you show up on time, you do all the things. Is there ever a time that you would say it's okay to say to the podcast host, look, this is not what I expected? Is there ever a time where either a guest or a host should or can stop a recording? Has that ever happened to you? Is there ever a time? I mean, I've been in podcasts before where I'm like, oh, I don't know.
Okay. I think, if you're uncomfortable, I came across an interview once. So it was a client who had their own podcast, and they told me that they'd interviewed somebody and they didn't feel it was a health podcast, and they didn't feel that the information shared when they looked at it was accurate, the findings. And what they did in that instance was they continued with the interview, but afterwards double checked the facts and said, I'm really sorry, but we can't use this. So it depends. Sometimes hosts will get you to fill in a waiver, giving rights. But if not, you get to the end and maybe you're really unhappy, you're within your rights, I think, to say that you would rather not go ahead. I think as a host, you want to be friendly. You want to put your guest at ease. You want to build that rapport, don't you? You want to talk about the things that they're comfortable talking about. It shouldn't feel like an attack or in it, or in any way uncomfortable. But I know sometimes we go into these situations maybe when it's someone we're not familiar with, and that can happen. So I think, you have to do what you feel comfortable with.
Right. And so let's talk about that as a closing. I have been doing this for almost 2 years. How long have you been podcasting, Victoria?
Almost 2 years. Yeah. 2 years in November.
Yeah, same for me. So as a host, I have accepted 2 or 3 pitches from people that I didn't know to get guests on my show. Other than that, these have been people I've met or I've been introduced to. And of the 3 people that came on my show that I didn't know, 2 of them canceled. And one of them didn't show up and one canceled. So I'm a little weary of people I don't know. And that's kind of where my next question was going to go. When somebody gets recommended or gets pitched, how much have you found that when you don't know somebody, there's more prep work? Or how can you vet somebody to be a good guest, I guess is really what I'm asking.
So again, it's coming from both sides. When we're pitching our clients as guests, we say to them, the first thing that a host's going to do when they get a pitch from us is look you up. So you want to make sure that your presence is good. It's giving the impression that you want it to, that you're happy. Because I think I was talking to another host and she'd had a pitch and she said that the lady had done all these speaking events, and she said when she actually started Googling her, and having a look, she couldn't find them. And because she didn't know her, she was like, I don't know, but I didn't kind of trust her with my audience, so that was a no. So coming from that other point of view, I suppose, so if you get a pitch, check them out, see if you can find any other recordings that they've done, and what did it sound like, and is it kind of an energy match? Are you interested in their topics? It's always difficult, I think, to know when we're working with clients and we're booking them. We're always reminding them on the day, you've got this interview today, you've got this, it's in your calendar, it's coming up, and we liaise. So I think maybe there's that reassurance with some agencies that don't know how it all work, but just try to get a feel for them, do some research into who they are, I think, and if they...
Right. So what I'm hearing you say is if there's a PR pitch, if there's an agency behind it who does the liaising and who then helps their client show up on time and does all that stuff, then it can totally work. I guess this was maybe more of a private VA pitch that I got given, and then there was no follow-up, and my guest didn't show up. So I was a little wary after that. I'm like, okay, I'm not sure I want to do that anymore. So let's go to the Victoria. When people want to, connect with you and they want to learn more about you and your agency, and somebody might be like, I need Victoria in my back pocket. I want to get better guests. I want to be a guest on other people's podcasts. I need to hire somebody to do this right for me, because listening to Victoria, I know I'm not doing it right. How can they get in touch with you? Where should they meet you?
Okay. Oh, well, we've got a page for your listeners. So it's www.victoriabennion.com/strategy-talks. And on this page, there's all the ways that we can connect. And there's also some free gifts. So there's a free Canva one-sheet template. And this is something that you can use to put your biography on, headshots, some suggested topics and questions. So you can just fill it in. And also a checklist you can go through for how to be an excellent guest.
That is wonderful. I'll make sure to put that in the show notes. So if you're listening to this, you can click on the show notes, and that link will be in there. And if you're live with us, I'll go back to all the places where we're live, and I'll put that link. So if you've listened to this, I will go ahead and share that link with you, so you can click on it and find all these wonderful tips. And the template is wonderful. Victoria, you have been a fantastic guest. I love that you didn't just tell us what to do, but you're showing us how to be a great guest. I appreciate you so much. I loved meeting you earlier this year in California, and that's really how I get a lot of my guests, by being out and about at conferences and meeting interesting people and saying, hey, let's stay in contact and let's be on each other's podcast if both of us have a podcast. I love that. And having that personal connection with people, I think, makes you a good guest as well. Having an interest in what the host is doing, what their business is like, and being able to chat as a business owner to business owner, or if you're both in the same area of employment or whatever the connection is there. I think having a connection makes you be a better guest. So anything that we didn't touch on, Victoria, that you want to give our guests as they go on this journey of being podcast guests, something that I might have missed or didn't ask about?
I suppose only one thing we didn't talk about was nerves. So for anyone who wants to be a guest, but maybe they're thinking, oh, that's maybe a bit scary, or I'm not sure, I would say just remember that, as you saying, really, it's a one-on-one conversation. So if you focus on the conversation that you're having with the host and forget who might be listening, that can really put you at ease. And the more you do, the easier it gets. Once you've done 4 or 5, your nerves start to sort of disappear. That could be really helpful. In fact, I had an email from a client this morning who was checking in with her about an interview later, and she said, I'm actually really looking forward to it. She said, I can't believe I'm saying this. A few weeks ago, months ago, I would have been really scared, but now I'm looking forward to it. So that's what I would say. Just get started.
That is wonderful advice. It's a great way to end strategy talks. Thank you so much for being here, Victoria. Thank you so much to those of you who were here live with us and those of you who listen to this as a podcast. I'll be back next week with another episode of Strategy Talks. See you later. Bye, everybody.